Well, good morning, everyone, and I want to extend to each of you who are in the studio or here in the room with me my gratitude for you showing up today. It's only 11 degrees outside, and you really kind of braved the storm and the weather, and if you're at home around a fire and drinking coffee and hot chocolate, we love you too. But we're glad we're all gathered today, and as we often say, it takes hundreds of volunteers on a weekend to make what happens at Preston Trail happen. And we shout out those people who serve on a regular basis. But there are some people who are fools for Jesus, and they're on our parking team, and they're serving today. They're out there, and it's Kyle and Rob, Ken, Bill, and Steve. And if anybody ever needed some affirmation and a shout out, it's those guys today. So let's do that. The Apostle Paul said he longs to know the power of the resurrection and to share in Jesus' sufferings. And those guys are going to know the power of the resurrection because they're sharing in his sufferings today. Well, last week, Paul did an incredible job introducing the Sermon on the Mount, helping us understand the background and the theme and the relevance. And today, I want to build on his excellent foundation and really speak to the significance of the Sermon on the Mount to those of us who are living this year in 2024. Now, to begin with, though, I need to just go back and do a few more introductory kinds of things to go back to the last few verses of chapter 4. And in those last few verses, we read about Jesus. He's announcing the kingdom is coming. He's healing people of every disease, whether from a common cold to being demon-possessed, and the crowds are showing up. I mean, they're following him everywhere. And then he kind of just stops doing that, and according to Matthew's chronology, he kind of stops down and focuses on teaching. Now, one of my favorite commentators is a man by the name of Dale Bruner. And in his comments about this particular text, he asked this question: why would Jesus leave such a successful healing ministry to undertake a teaching one? And I think that's a really good question. And I really like the way he answered. He says he believes that Jesus really wants to practice preventive medicine as well as curative medicine. He's been curing a lot of people, but he also recognizes the importance of both and that's what he's doing. And Jesus understands the things that make us sick. There are certain pathogens that cause us to be ill, and Jesus understands the power of words as a pathogen. Words can heal us. Words can integrate us. Words can make us whole. But the wrong words, they can literally make us sick. They can turn the direction of our life. They can break us. And these words of Jesus that he spoke are words that are intended, if we hear them and we follow them, we will find wholeness in our lives. But I think he also is kind of focusing on this teaching ministry now for a second reason, and it is this. He wants to invite his disciples, you and me, into this preventative medicine adventure. And he wants us to make an impact on public health, the people around us. Now, after he says those things, he concludes with something that has caught my mind and heart. I can't get rid of it. I think it's really important, and it really nails down the importance of today's message in this entire series. And here's what he says. When we believe and obey Jesus' teaching, we become the major antibodies in a sick world. Let me say that again. When people who call Jesus Lord, when they hear these words and follow him, they become major antibodies in this sick world. Now, I don't know about you, but I've noticed our world's getting sicker. Have you noticed that? Not only simply physically, but our world is getting sicker emotionally and morally and relationally and spiritually. And the words and teaching of Jesus, I believe, can inject a massive healing dose of the elixir of truth and grace. Truth and grace. Now, a few months ago, I read this incredible article by David Brooks in The Atlantic. It's called How America Got Mean. David Brooks is a conservative columnist, grew up Jewish. He married a woman who went to Wheaton, and now he's a follower of Christ. And he wrote a beautiful, challenging, sobering article called How Did America Get Mean? And he cites the example of a restaurant owner in New York City who has to eject a person from his restaurant at least once a week for rude and cruel behavior. He highlights the testimony of a head nurse at a hospital who can't keep other nurses on her staff because patients have become so abusive. Hate crimes actually have risen to the highest level in the last decade in 2020. And in 2002, get this, over 2/3 of American households gave to charity. But by 2018, less than half of American households give anything outside to help others. And he says, and the words that now define our age reek of menace, conspiracy, polarization, mass shootings, trauma, and safe spaces. And then he draws this conclusion. We're enmeshed in some sort of emotional, relational, and spiritual crisis. And that even undergirds our political dysfunction and the general crisis of our democracy. What is going on? That's a really good question. Have you asked yourself, why are we going through this right now? What's causing all of these things? And Brooks kind of points out all the usual suspects. Well, it's social media, or now people are living in isolation. There's a challenge of changing demographics, financial inequality, but he nails down one thing that he thinks is the primary reason. He says, we are now living in a culture where people are no longer trained to treat others with kindness and consideration, to disagree with others without being disagreeable and disrespectful. He said, we have abandoned in our culture moral formation. And I think he's right. He said, we used to have two things. We used to have a web of institutions like families and schools, religious and community organizations, and workplaces, which actually taught and formed people into the kind and responsible neighbors and citizens that we should be. Now, I remember growing up a Boy Scout. Do you remember your Boy Scout pledge? I promise, what? To do my duty to God and to my country, and to obey the Scout law, to help other people at all times, and to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and what? Morally straight. We don't have those institutions anymore. In schools today, teaching moral values has gone by the wayside. And he said the second reason is because we used to have a loosely agreed upon understanding of moral order. There was some agreement about what is right and what is wrong. If you look at the history of moral authority and what helped us make decisions back before the Enlightenment, people made decisions based on revelation, on what God said in His Word. After the Enlightenment, people made decisions based on reason. And reason is good. It doesn't always trump revelation, right? But he said, now today, we are making decisions based on how we feel. And that has isolated us, and we have no sense of moral order. And both of these things, this web of institutions that help people, train people morally, and also to have a sense of what is right and wrong, for all practical purposes, are gone. So it is now into this toxic and dysfunctional culture that we're called to be healing antibodies by following and obeying and living like Jesus. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This will never work. You know, we saw some of the words of Jesus go across the screen during the bumper before I came up. And when you look at Jesus' words, some of them seem so soft and kind of touchy-feely. And some people think they actually are kind of woke. But just in case you've forgotten, our nation is celebrating a man this week who was a Christ follower, who understood the Sermon on the Mount and believed it and led a movement of nonviolence based on the Sermon on the Mount. And his movement became a massive antibody in our nation that literally wiped out 2 centuries of deeply embedded racism in our nation. Now, he didn't do that just out of some philosophical understanding. He did it, and you can read about it in his autobiography. Martin Luther King Jr. says this: it was the Sermon on the Mount rather than a doctrine of passive resistance that initially inspired our brothers in Montgomery to dignified social action. It was Jesus of Nazareth that stirred us to protest with the creative weapon of love. There is power in Jesus' words to be an antibody. And so here's the thing. As we enter this series, I want to let you guys see behind the curtain a little bit. We plan our series a year out. We go away on retreats to pray and ask God to give us guidance about things. And it was a consensus of our worship team. That's Paul and me, Allison Harrell, Allison Lehman, and Warren Jacobs, that as we looked into 2024 and all the potential craziness that is out there in front of us, now we have the fog of war, we have the coming elections, and we just felt more than ever before that as followers of Jesus, we need to hear a prophetic call that we are to become antibodies for Jesus in this sick world. And so today, and as we move through this whole series, that's our belief. We can't control stuff outside of, North Texas here, outside of our homes or whatever, but we can be faithful where we live, work, and play, to be faithful to Jesus and be an antibody in this crazy world. So with that in mind, I invite you to open your Bibles or log on to your device to Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to be looking at verses 5 through 7 today. Matthew 5 through 7, we're in the Beatitudes, and these are 3 meaningful ones. Here's what I would say. The tagline for our series is a surprising path to a good life. But I would add to that today, I'd like to just kind of explain it a bit more and say, this is a surprising path to a good life, a rich, full, and meaningful and impactful life in the world. Here's Jesus' words. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. So I want to take a few moments and break down each one of those Beatitudes and show how it's a very surprising thing that if you sense these and you embrace these and you live these out, it will be a surprising pathway to a good, meaningful, satisfying, and impactful life as an antibody in the world. So here we go. The first one is this: the surprising impact of those who live humbly. Now, humility is not trending in our world today. Have you picked up on that? The domineering and the aggressive, the harsh and the hateful vie to establish their own little kingdoms and lord it over those that stand in their way. Jesus' way is reverse. He says, God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. Now, you may know this already, but Jesus is actually drawing specifically from Psalm 37:11 that reads, but the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant prosperity. The word praeus in Greek there that is used, that is translated as humble or gentle, is also used of Moses in Numbers 12:3, where it says, now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. Now, a quick aside, Moses is kind of noted as the author of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and so maybe this is a personal shout out that he was the most humble person, on the face of the earth. I don't know. But this word praeus is also used of Jesus when he says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am gentle and humble of heart. Now here's the thing. This humility, this meekness, as the King James says, is not to be confused with weakness. No one would ever accuse Moses of being weak. He stood up to the Pharaoh with nothing more than a staff. Jesus was not meek and weak. He was humble. And he stared death down as an incredibly brave and loving man. Don't ever confuse humility with weakness. To live humbly means to actually harness one's own strength in the service of a greater good. To be humble doesn't mean being meek and mild or be a living, breathing doormat for others. It is the picture of someone who is strong, authoritative, confident, who harnesses their resources, lowers themselves to work for the well-being and the goodness of other people. But here's what Jesus says. When you live that way, those who live humbly will receive a greater realm of influence. Now, Jesus says in his word specifically, if you live humbly, you will inherit the entire earth. Now, he's not talking about like when you die, you get 40 acres and a mule and you'll be a boomer sooner. Heaven forbid, that could be hell. So I'm saying it's not that. I'm just kidding, I love people in Oklahoma. But what it means is that we will be given in this life and the life to come a place of influence and standing. One of the best books I've read in a long time is by Adam Grant called Give and Take. And he says there are two kinds of people in the world, those who are givers and those who are takers. People who are takers take advantage of others in every opportunity to enhance and to enrich themselves. Givers, on the other hand, are those who share what they have and what they know and what they've experienced with others so that they can enhance and enrich their lives. And what he says is, the data, Adam Grant teaches at the Wharton School of Business, he says what the data says is that the people who are givers go further and receive greater success and greater standing and greater position. They are inheriting a place and standing. Branch Rickey wanted to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947. Many of you know the story of Jackie Robinson. He was an outstanding player in the Negro Leagues. He was a letterman in 4 sports at UCLA. And they met and they talked about him breaking the color barrier, and they talked very frankly about the abuse that he would get from opposing teammates, abusive fans, even knockdown pitches from opposing pitchers. Now, clearly, Jackie Robinson was a very competitive, strong, and aggressive player, and it wasn't natural for him to back down really from anything, so this was going to be a challenge. There was a pitcher, though, who befriended him on the Brooklyn Dodgers. His name is Lee Fund. And he says, as I look back on Jackie, specifically, he looked to Christ as his example. In all my years with him, on the field and off the field, I never saw him lose his cool. His gentle strength, and he uses the word, and his meekness was on display, and it was ultimately victorious. And then he concludes by saying The thing that most people don't know about Jackie, it was that he was a sincere Christian who sought to emulate the example of Jesus, that when he received all kinds of unjust criticism and comments, he quelled his righteous anger by remembering the one who said, I am gentle and humble in heart. And he has inherited part of the earth, because now every April 15th, every Major League Baseball player wears the number 42, his number, on that day. And the number 42 has been retired from every Major League Baseball team. It was his meekness, it was his strength and humility, and he has earned place and standing. He's inherited the baseball earth because of his humility. Now, here's one thing I want to ask you to do this week. Just here's a practical thing to think about. I want to ask you to think of one relationship or responsibility in which you have tried to assert your control, to dominate, to make sure you get what you want. And this week, I want to challenge you to make a concerted effort to use your authority or your strength or your resources for the sake of someone else or something else other than yourself. And take a step of humility this week and see if indeed some of the place and standing of the earth begin to come to you because you're living like Jesus. Here's the second thing. This is a surprising impact of those who crave for justice to be done. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. Most of the time in our translations, the word righteousness is there. It has different facets to it. It can be righteous with God, being in a right relationship with God. It can mean living the right kind of life. But I think the New Living Translation gets it right when they translate it not righteousness, but justice. When you look at the context of God, of what Jesus has been talking about, the poor in spirit and those who mourn, he's talking about those who are on the outs, those who are impressed, those who are struggling. And he is saying, blessed are those who hunger and thirst to make things right. But here's something interesting. It is the craving for justice that is the essential motivation that leads to justice being done. No, Jesus blesses those who simply crave justice, not actually those who actually get it done. He's saying, hey, listen, if you'll just start hungering and thirsting for this, you're going to be blessed. Because he knows that ultimately, once you begin to crave for the right to be done, we'll actually begin to do something. Jesus understood all of these things. He knew from the power structures that were around him. The Roman Empire controlled where he lived. Also the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And Jesus was a change agent. And he understands how difficult it is to change people and structures and things. You can only do it incrementally. And I think Martin Luther King's one of his best quotes is this: the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But if justice is ever going to be done here in our world, in our community, it has to begin in the hearts of men and women like you and me who hunger and thirst for it. That's what happened to Martin Luther King. He hungered that voting rights would finally be given to his people. Gary Haugen had a hunger and thirst for the women who were caught in sex trafficking. We have multiple community partners who have started ministries because they have a hunger and thirst to make it right. Tim and Marcy Baser in our church started Blake's House because they had a hunger and thirst to make it right for kids in foster care who were aging out and had no place to go. And what Jesus is saying, when you simply begin to crave this, things will begin to happen. I have a new friend. He married into my friend group that I've had for like 40 years. And his name is Roger. He's in his 70s. He's retired now. He has some means, and he kind of built a new house out by a lake in Central Texas. And so he doesn't seem to really need stuff, and he can really be self-contained. But he is a CASA volunteer. Some of you know who CASA volunteers are. CASA stands for Court-Appointed Special Advocates. And they advocate for abused children who are under the care of CPS. And what they do is they gather data from foster parents and lawyers and teachers and judges and social workers, and they report to a judge, and they advocate for these children who have been abused, neglected, left. And so to do that, though, you have to go through 30 hours of intensive training. You really volunteer about 15 hours a week. It's a very, very intense kind of thing. And so we were talking about that, and I simply asked this past week, and I said, Roger, why are you a CASA volunteer? And he said, well, I've really learned to love these guys. He drives 115 miles one way once a month to see two boys who are allowed one call and one Christmas gift to give, and they call him every Thursday, and they gave him gifts for Christmas. I said, what got you into that? And here's what he said. I guess I can sum it up best by the end of my CASA training when they brought 3 people up to speak. And he said the first 2 people to speak were women. And they said, listen, every time I leave my kids, I go home crying and I'm so upset, all this stuff. And he said the last guy to speak was a man. And he said this, when I leave my kids, I don't go home and cry. I just go home because I'm pissed off that kids are abused sexually, physically, and they're abandoned by their family. He says, that's why I'm a CASA volunteer. He hungers and thirsts and craves for rightness to be done. And that's what Jesus is calling us to. Now, here's the thing. Those who crave for justice to be done will find deep satisfaction in joining God where he is working for justice in the world. That's what Jesus says. When you crave, when you hunger and thirst after righteousness, you will be filled. Working for justice to make things right and seeing that it is done is its own reward. That is when you see that your hands and feet have become the hands and feet of Jesus, and you're doing things for those people who need to have things made right. It could be as simple as gathering coats for those who have none in this weather. It can be working in a homeless shelter or supporting an orphan or a disadvantaged. It can be feeding the hungry or advocating for the unborn or the abused or the trafficked. It doesn't matter. When you do those things, your hand is on the moral arc of the universe and you're bending it just a little bit. And when you bend it just a little bit, there's this deep satisfaction that you've joined God in what he is doing in the world, and you are making a difference with your one and only life. So let me ask you this. As you think about this particular beatitude, I want to invite you to stop sometime this week. Take a note on this, or you can get this on our app. And I want you to stop and listen to your heart. Where in the world are you craving for things to be made right? If you're a follower of Jesus and the Holy Spirit is in you, there's some places in there where he's at work. Where is your heart craving for things to be made right? And then humbly take one step that will bend the arc of your life just a bit more toward justice. Truly open your heart and spirit to God this week to show you where you can make that kind of difference, where you can be an antibody in the world. And now the last one for today. The surprising impact of extending mercy in a judgmental world. Now listen, I think we all know the religious culture in Jesus' day was harsh and judgmental. Mercy was in short supply. And here's the reason. Because the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they wanted to see the Messiah come, but in their current thinking, their thinking was the Messiah won't come until every Jewish person on a single day repents and keeps the law all day. And if everybody can do it just one day, then the Messiah will come. And so that's why the Pharisees and the Sadducees, especially the Pharisees, were so judgmental, because every time they saw someone sinning, that means the Messiah is going to have to put it off another day. And so that's why they were so harsh and so cruel in that. That's why they were so judgmental towards sinners. Now today, we don't have Pharisees and Sadducees. We have the politically correct crowd. And if you don't abide by political correctness of some of the elites on the left, then you lose your job, you lose your reputation, you lose respect. Nick Cave is a singer-songwriter for a rock band in Australia. Okay. And some of it is called Bad Seeds, the name of the band. Some of you have heard of him. He has an incredible quote, and here it is. Cancel culture is mercy's antithesis. Political correctness has grown to become the unhappiest religion in the world. Its once honorable attempt to reimagine our society in a more equitable way now embodies all the worst aspects that religion has to offer and none of the beauty. Moral certainty and self-righteousness, shorn even of the capacity for redemption. It has become quite literally bad religion run amok. And what Jesus says is, God blesses the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And to extend mercy means to offer forgiveness to those who don't deserve it, and to help those who cannot do without it. And most of the time, we tend to be forgiving, but we only like to forgive the people that we think are deserving, or who think like us and act like us and look like us. But mercy, in its essence, is forgiving someone who does not deserve it at all. And here's the thing about mercy. It is one of life's gifts that is easily multiplied and reciprocated. You see, the kingdom expectation is that when we show mercy, mercy will be given back to us. Mercy is something that by its very nature just longs to be paid forward. That's why Jesus tells us the parable in Matthew 18 about the man who had a humongous debt. He could never repay it, and his debt holder forgave him. And then he goes out and he demands $5 from his buddy, that he loaned him about a month ago. And Jesus says that guy is in danger of hellfire, because mercy is the thing that when you receive it, you give it. And when you get it back again, you give it again. It's reciprocal. The order of our day is harsh cancellation. We have become, many of us, secular perfectionists, but the kingdom is the opposite. And when we are merciful to people we don't agree with, or merciful to people who make mistakes, then here's the thing, we can expect in our lives mercy in return, because we're doing nothing more than acting like Jesus, the one who showed us ultimate mercy. So here's one thing I want to invite you to do this week. I want to invite you to keep an eye out this week for someone who is showing mercy to another person. And then I want you to look for a way to show your mercy to that mercy giver. I want you to be the answer to the paying it forward, that you see someone being merciful. I want you to find a way to be merciful to them, so you will make Jesus' words come to fruition in their life. As I was thinking about these three particular Beatitudes, it finally dawned on me that Jesus is really elevating the teaching of Micah in Micah 6:8. And here's what Micah says. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And when you do that, you are living like Jesus, and you are being obedient to the call of God in your life. And what I'm excited about today is that we get to end our service by celebrating communion together. And so when you came in, you received the elements of communion. And what I love about communion is it is the act that Jesus gives to remind us of who he is and what he's done. And so as you think about Jesus this morning, we can remember that he was the one who was gentle and humble. He harnessed his strength for your sake and mine. He craved justice, making things right with people, between God and themselves and others. And he is the quintessential example of mercy, forgiving us when we don't deserve it. And so on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he met and had Passover supper with his disciples for the last time. And as they gathered around the table, he passed the bread, he broke it, and he prayed a prayer of blessing over it. Father, as we take this bread today, may we remember the humility and the craving for justice and the mercy of Jesus. Amen. Jesus then took the cup and he said, "This cup represents my blood of the new covenant, a new way of being with God." And that new way is simply this: we have already been forgiven. My blood covers all of your sins. And now you can live a life of gratitude and thankfulness as we follow Jesus in the world. So Father, thank you for this cup.